They left her body outside the church for 3 days because they said Apache blood did not belong in sacred ground. By the 4th morning, even the crows had stopped landing near her. Snow drifted across the empty street of Dry Creek in thin silver lines, gathering softly on the woman's dark braided hair and the wool blanket someone had thrown over her during the night. Nobody admitted to leaving the blanket there. In a town like Dry Creek, kindness was something people hid when nobody was looking. The church bell rang once through the cold air, low and hollow, but the doors stayed shut. Men walked past the body without turning their heads. Women pulled their children closer and crossed the street. The undertaker claimed he was sick. The gravedigger suddenly disappeared before sunrise. Even Father Matthew kept the curtains of the church windows closed tight as if prayer itself had become ashamed. Near the wooden steps, a little boy no older than 7 stared at the blanket-covered figure with wide, uncertain eyes. He tugged gently on his mother's sleeve. "Why won't they bury her?" he whispered. The woman stiffened. Her face turned pale beneath the frost collecting on her bonnet. "Don't ask questions," she muttered quickly, pulling him away before he could speak again. But the question stayed hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Because everyone in Dry Creek knew who the woman was. Elena Redbird, the Apache healer who lived alone near the Cedar Hills beyond town. The same woman they secretly visited after dark when fever took their children. The same woman who stitched ranch hands back together after cattle accidents. The same woman who never asked for payment from widows or hungry families. At night, they knocked on her cabin door with desperation in their eyes. By daylight, they pretended they had never seen her at all. The sound of hoofbeats rolled slowly through the frozen street just after dawn. Heavy, measured, the kind of rhythm that made men glance toward their windows before they realized they were doing it. Silas Boone rode into town beneath a gray winter sky, his long coat dusted with snow, his horse breathing steam into the bitter air. He stopped when he saw the shape beneath the blanket. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind creaked the church sign overhead while the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Silas climbed down from the saddle slowly, boots crunching against frozen dirt. He walked toward the body while 2 ranchers standing outside the saloon watched nervously from across the street. "Don't touch her," one of them finally called out. Town council already decided. Silas knelt anyway. He pulled back the corner of the blanket carefully. Frost clung to Elena's eyelashes. Snow rested along the edges of her dark hair like pale ash. And even in death, her face looked tired more than angry, as if she had spent too many years carrying the weight of other people's fear. Silas lowered the blanket again without a word. Then he stood and looked toward the church doors. "Father Matthew," he called quietly, though his voice carried through the whole street. The curtains shifted inside. Nothing more. Silas glanced at the men watching him from the saloon porch. "She helped half this town breathe through winter," he said. "Now none of you can spare 6 feet of dirt?" Nobody answered him. One man spit into the snow. Another turned away, pretending to fix his gloves. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut against the cold. Silas looked back down at the blanket-covered woman. His jaw tightened once, barely noticeable. Then he reached for the edge of the sled tied behind his horse. "Fine," he muttered softly. "If this town's too proud to bury her." He pulled a shovel from the sled and rested it across his shoulder. "Then I'll dig the grave myself." The wind picked up hard by late afternoon, dragging sheets of dust and snow through the empty streets of Dry Creek while Silas Boone worked alone behind the church. The hill sat half a mile above town where the earth turned rocky and stubborn, the kind of ground that fought every inch of steel driven into it. Each strike of the shovel echoed across the frozen hillside with a dull iron sound that carried farther than church bells. Men heard it from the saloon porch. Women heard it through cracked kitchen windows. Nobody came to help. Silas drove the shovel down again, boots slipping against frozen dirt. Sweat darkened the collar of his coat despite the cold. His hands were already raw beneath his gloves, but he kept digging with the same slow rhythm as sunset bled red across the plains. Down below, Dry Creek carried on pretending nothing unusual was happening. Horses shuffled outside the general store. Poker players laughed too loudly inside the saloon. Smoke curled from chimneys into the gray evening sky. But every now and then, somebody glanced toward the hill where a lone figure kept working beside an empty grave. Near dusk, Father Matthew finally climbed the slope carrying a lantern beneath his coat. The old priest moved carefully through the wind, shoulders hunched low like a man afraid even the snow might judge him. Silas did not stop digging when he heard the footsteps approach. "You should not be out here alone," Father Matthew said quietly. Silas shoved another load of frozen earth aside. "Funny," he answered without looking up. "Seems that is exactly where this town wanted me." The priest lowered his eyes. In the fading light, he looked older than he had that morning. "The council fears trouble," he murmured. "There are ranchers still angry over the old Apache raids. People remember what they lost." Silas leaned against the shovel handle for the first time in nearly an hour. His breath rolled white into the air. "Funny thing about memory," he said. "Folks here remember every bad thing done by an Apache 20 years ago, but they forget who kept their children alive last winter." Father Matthew had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them while the wind rattled dry cedar branches overhead. Finally, the priest reached beneath his coat and pulled out a small cloth sack. "I found these in the church donation box this morning," he said softly. "Nobody signed their names." Silas opened the sack. Inside were medicine herbs tied carefully with red thread. Elena's herbs. He stared at them for a long moment without speaking. "They still came to her," he said quietly, "even while pretending to hate her." Father Matthew nodded once, shame settling across his face like dust. "At night," he admitted, "mostly after dark. Mothers with sick babies, ranch hands with fever, miners coughing blood after winter storms." He swallowed hard before continuing. "She never turned anyone away." The lantern flame flickered wildly as another cold gust swept across the hill. Far below, the first saloon piano began to play faintly through town, cheerful and careless against the sound of steel biting frozen earth. Silas closed the cloth sack carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he looked toward the church steeple rising black against the evening sky. "Did she ever ask you for anything?" he asked. Father Matthew hesitated. "Only once." "What was it?" The priest's voice nearly disappeared beneath the wind. "She asked if God still listened to people like her." Silas stared at the half-finished grave while darkness settled slowly over the hill. Somewhere below town, laughter drifted through the cold night air. But up there beside the frozen dirt and the lonely cedar trees, the world felt heavy and painfully quiet. Silas gripped the shovel again and drove it back into the earth. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "this town is going to remember her." The coffin took shape slowly beneath the weak yellow glow of an oil lantern while snow drifted against the barn walls outside. Silas Boone worked alone long after midnight, sleeves rolled past his wrists, rough hands steady despite the cold biting through the cracks in the timber. Every hammer strike sounded heavier than it should have inside the quiet barn. Wood, iron, silence. Then another strike. The boards came from an old cedar fence he had torn down behind his cabin 2 winters earlier. It was not fine lumber. The edges were uneven, still scarred from years of wind and rain out on the plains. But Silas sanded every corner smooth anyway. He measured twice before driving each nail. Careful, respectful, the way a man builds something meant to carry more than weight. Elena's body rested nearby beneath fresh blankets beside 2 burning lanterns. Somebody had braided sage into the folds of the cloth while Silas worked. He knew Father Matthew had not done it. The old priest barely had the courage to climb the hill before dark, which meant someone else had come silently during the night, someone ashamed enough to hide their kindness. Outside, the storm worsened. Wind hissed through the cedar trees and rattled loose shutters against the cabin walls. Around 1 in the morning, hoofbeats approached through the snow. Silas glanced toward the barn door but did not reach for the rifle resting nearby. The rider stopped outside without calling out. A moment later, the door creaked open just enough for a gust of freezing air to slip inside. Sheriff Walter Grady stepped into the lantern light slowly, snow dusting the brim of his hat and shoulders. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. Silas kept hammering another nail into place. "If you came to stop me," he said without looking up, "you should have brought more men." The sheriff removed his gloves carefully, avoiding Silas's eyes. "I did not come for trouble. That makes one of us." Grady stared at the covered body near the wall for several long seconds before speaking again. "Town council is nervous," he muttered quietly. "Word is spreading to nearby settlements." Silas dragged the hammer across another nailhead. "Good." The sheriff exhaled slowly through his nose. "You could bury her outside town. Quietly. Let this pass." At that, Silas finally stopped working. The barn fell still except for the storm pressing against the roof overhead. He looked directly at the sheriff for the first time all night. "She spent 10 years patching up the people of this town," he said. "Now you want her buried like something folks should hide?" Grady swallowed hard but said nothing. His eyes drifted toward the coffin taking shape beneath the lantern glow. Something about it seemed to bother him more than anger would have. Because anger could be fought. Shame could not. Silas reached for another cedar plank. "You know what I remember most about her?" he asked quietly. The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Winter before last. Your daughter caught scarlet fever." Grady's face tightened immediately. "Leave my family out of this. Whole town thought little Emily would die before Christmas morning," Silas continued calmly. "Dr. Jenkins gave up. After 2 days." The sheriff's jaw clenched. Snow melted slowly from his hat brim onto the barn floor. "But Elena stayed beside that girl 3 nights straight," Silas said. "Never slept. Never left." The hammer struck another nail. Sharp. Final. "And now the same town she saved will not even give her 6 feet of ground." Sheriff Grady stared at the floorboards beneath his boots as if searching for something there. Maybe courage. Maybe an excuse. Outside, the storm groaned across the plains while the lantern flames trembled softly in the dark barn. After a long silence, the sheriff reached slowly into his coat pocket and placed something on the workbench beside the coffin. A small silver cross no bigger than a thumb, tarnished with age. "Emily wore this the night Elena saved her," he said quietly. "Elena kept it after the fever broke." Silas looked at the cross without speaking. The sheriff turned toward the door again, shoulders heavy beneath the weight of snow and regret. Just before stepping outside, he paused. "Town council plans to stop the burial tomorrow," he murmured. "And this time, they mean it." Morning arrived gray and bitter over Dry Creek. Frost clung to the rooftops like ash while church bells rang weak across town, uncertain and hollow in the cold air. Silas Boone guided the wagon slowly up the hill behind the church just after sunrise, the cedar coffin resting steady beneath a thick wool blanket. His horse moved carefully through frozen mud while the wheels creaked against patches of old snow. Nobody spoke as he passed through town, but curtains shifted behind nearly every window. People were watching, always watching. The grave waited on the hillside beneath a cluster of cedar trees bent crooked by years of desert wind. The dirt beside it sat piled in frozen heaps where Silas had worked through half the night. He climbed down from the wagon stiffly, exhaustion heavy in his shoulders, and rested one hand against the coffin for a quiet moment before reaching for the shovel again. Below the hill, the town had begun gathering near the church steps. Ranchers in heavy coats, store owners, miners fresh from the edge camps. Some stood with arms folded, tight against the cold, while others kept glancing toward the coffin like they were afraid even looking too long might stain them somehow. Father Matthew stood near the church doors clutching a Bible against his chest, pale and uncertain beneath the winter sky. Then came the sound of boots climbing the hill, slow at first, then several more behind them. Silas looked up as 4 members of the town council approached through the frost-covered grass. At the front walked Harold Finch, owner of the largest cattle ranch in Dry Creek and a man who wore bitterness the same way other men wore hats. "This burial stops now," Finch announced loudly enough for the people below to hear. Silas leaned both hands on the shovel handle but said nothing. Finch glanced toward the coffin with open disgust. That woman had no place among decent folk while she lived, he continued. She sure as hell does not belong buried beside them. A few nervous murmurs drifted from the crowd below. Silas watched the wind tug loose strands of frost from the cedar branches overhead before finally answering. Funny, he said quietly. Your wife thought different when Elena treated her pneumonia last February. Finch's face hardened immediately. Mind your tongue. Or what? Silas asked. The silence that followed spread across the hillside like cold smoke. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Even the horse seemed to stand still beneath the gray morning sky. Finch stepped closer, boots crunching against frozen dirt. You bury her here, he warned. And folks in this town are going to remember whose side you chose. Silas looked past him toward the people gathered below the church. Men he had known 20 years. Men who once rode cattle beside him through dust storms and drought. Men who now lowered their eyes instead of speaking. Seems to me, Silas said slowly, this town already chose its side. The wind rose harder across the hill, carrying the distant creak of church signs and the smell of chimney smoke from below. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a child started crying before being hushed quickly into silence. Then another voice spoke unexpectedly. Let the woman rest. Heads turned. Immediately toward the church steps where Maria Alvarez stood wrapped in a faded brown shawl, hands trembling slightly in the cold. Most people knew her husband had died 3 winters earlier after a mining collapse. What few knew was who had sat beside her son through 10 straight nights of fever afterward. Maria climbed the hill slowly, boots sinking into patches of snow. In her hands she carried a small bundle tied carefully in white cloth. She stopped beside the coffin without looking at the councilman. Elena made this for my boy before he died, she said softly. Her fingers unfolded the cloth to reveal a tiny pair of stitched leather gloves no larger than a child's hands. She stayed with him until his last breath because I was too weak to stand. Nobody answered her. Finch shifted uncomfortably while several townspeople looked away toward the church windows. Maria placed the gloves gently atop the coffin lid. You men speak of decency, she whispered, but that woman showed more mercy in one winter than this whole town has shown all week. The hill fell silent again except for the sound of wind moving through the cedar trees above the grave. The silence after Maria Alvarez spoke felt heavier than the storm clouds hanging over Dry Creek. Nobody on the hillside seemed willing to move first. Men shifted their boots against frozen dirt. Women tightened shawls around their shoulders while avoiding each other's eyes. Even Harold Finch looked uncertain now, though pride still sat stiff across his face like old leather left too long in the sun. Silas Boone rested both hands on the shovel handle beside the open grave and watched the crowd carefully. He had spent enough years around cattle to recognize the exact moment a herd started turning. Slow at first, nervous, then all at once. The wind swept harder across the hill, rattling cedar branches above the grave while the coffin sat quiet beneath its blanket and the tiny leather gloves Maria had placed there. Somewhere down in town, a dog barked once before everything fell silent again. Then another figure began climbing the hill. Old Thomas Reed moved slowly with the help of a wooden cane, his gray coat hanging loose against his thin frame. Most people in Dry Creek barely noticed him anymore. But every man there remembered who he used to be. 30 years earlier, Thomas Reed had ridden with the Union cavalry across half the frontier before age and winters bent his back. He stopped near the grave, breathing hard from the climb. His pale eyes settled on the coffin for a long moment before he spoke. She sat with my wife the night she passed, he said quietly. Held her hand because I could not stop shaking enough to do it myself. Nobody interrupted him. Reed reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed a folded piece of cloth tied with faded blue ribbon. He unfolded it carefully in the wind. Inside rested a pair of tiny silver spectacles with one cracked lens. My wife could barely see near the end, he continued. Elena fixed these for her by lantern light after midnight. His voice caught slightly before he steadied it again. Never charged a cent. The old veteran stepped toward the coffin and laid the spectacles beside the child's gloves. Two small objects resting against cedar wood beneath a cold winter sky. But somehow they carried more weight than any speech ever could. Murmurs moved quietly through the crowd now. Uneasy. Ashamed. A ranch hand near the back lowered his head. A woman wiped quickly at her eyes before anyone noticed. Harold Finch looked toward the church as if hoping somebody else would speak for him. Nobody did. Because the truth had begun moving through Dry Creek the same way winter wind moved across open land. Quiet at first, then impossible to stop. Father Matthew finally stepped forward, clutching the Bible tightly against his chest. Snowflakes drifted into the gray strands of his hair while his eyes moved slowly over the people gathered there. "Every soul deserves rest," he said softly, "and every town is judged by how it treats the forgotten." Finch scoffed bitterly, though the sound lacked conviction now. "You all going soft over one dead Apache woman?" he muttered. Silas looked at him calmly. "No," he answered. "They are remembering she was human." The words settled over the hillside with painful stillness. For the first time since morning, nobody answered Finch. Nobody nodded along. The councilman stared around at the faces surrounding him and realized something cold and unfamiliar. He was losing the crowd. Then came the sound that changed everything. Footsteps. Small ones. Sheriff Grady's daughter Emily appeared near the church steps, wrapped in a thick wool coat far too large for her tiny frame. Her cheeks were pale from the cold, but her eyes stayed fixed on the coffin as she climbed the hill alone. Sheriff Grady moved immediately as if to stop her, but the little girl pulled gently away from his hand before he could reach her. The entire town watched in silence while she walked through the snow carrying something carefully against her chest. When she reached the grave, she looked up at Silas Boone with trembling eyes. Then she placed a small jar of dried wildflowers on top of the coffin beside the gloves and spectacles. "Miss Elena gave these to me after I got better," she whispered softly. Her voice nearly disappeared in the wind. "She said flowers still grow after hard winters." Nobody on that hill spoke after that, because suddenly the grave no longer looked lonely. Snow began falling harder by late afternoon, drifting sideways across the hill in long pale curtains while the people of Dry Creek remained gathered around the grave. Nobody seemed willing to leave now. Not after the little girl spoke. Not after the gloves, the spectacles, and the jar of dried wildflowers resting quietly atop the cedar coffin beneath the gray winter sky. The town looked different suddenly. Smaller somehow. As if every lie people had carried for years no longer fit properly inside them. Silas Boone stood near the open grave with one hand resting against the shovel handle while cold wind pushed against his coat. Across from him, Sheriff Walter Grady stared at his daughter Emily with an expression caught somewhere between pride and shame. The little girl stayed beside the coffin, tiny boots half buried in snow, her small hands tucked tightly into oversized sleeves. Harold Finch finally broke the silence with a bitter scoff. "This is foolishness," he muttered, though his voice lacked the strength it carried that morning. "People are acting like she was some kind of saint." Nobody answered him right away. Then old Thomas Reed lifted his cane slightly and pointed toward the coffin. "No," the veteran said quietly. "We are acting like we forgot what gratitude looks like." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Several heads lowered immediately. One of the miners removed his hat slowly. A ranch woman near the church steps crossed herself beneath trembling fingers. Father Matthew closed his Bible gently and looked out across the gathered crowd. "There is a sickness worse than fever," he said softly. "It is the habit of looking away when kindness comes from the wrong hands." Wind swept through the cedar trees overhead, carrying the smell of snow and chimney smoke together across the hillside. Then something unexpected happened. A young ranch hand named Caleb Mercer stepped forward from the crowd, holding a bundle wrapped in rough canvas beneath his arm. Most people barely noticed him usually. He worked cattle for Harold Finch and rarely spoke more than necessary. But now every eye followed him as he approached the grave slowly through the snow. Caleb stopped beside the coffin and carefully unwrapped the canvas. Inside rested several folded papers tied together with faded red string. "These belong to my mother," he said quietly. "She passed last spring." His fingers shook slightly as he untied the string. Elena wrote these instructions for her treatments during the coughing sickness. He handed the papers toward Father Matthew. Dr. Jenkins said my mother would not survive winter. Caleb swallowed hard before continuing. Miss Elena stayed up 3 nights boiling herbs beside our stove. The young ranch hand glanced toward Harold Finch. You remember that, sir? You told me not to mention where the medicine came from. Finch's face drained pale beneath the cold wind. Murmurs moved through the crowd again. Heavier this time. Not angry anymore. Guilty. Because now memories were surfacing everywhere. Quiet ones people had buried beneath years of fear and prejudice. A blacksmith remembered Elena fixing his burned hand after a forge accident. A widow remembered finding food left silently outside her cabin during the drought. One by one, truths began stepping into daylight. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody needed to. The shame in the air had become louder than any argument. Sheriff Grady finally climbed the rest of the hill beside his daughter. Snow settled across his shoulders while he removed his badge slowly from his coat. The silver star looked dull beneath the cloudy sky. He turned it over once in his weathered hands before speaking. The night Emily got sick, he said quietly. I begged every doctor within 50 miles for help. His voice tightened. None came. He looked directly at the coffin now. Elena rode through a blizzard alone because she heard my little girl was dying. Emily reached for her father's hand while tears stood silently in the sheriff's eyes. And I repaid that mercy by standing silent while this town abandoned her. Nobody on the hill could look at him after that. The snow kept falling softly over Dry Creek while the coffin sat surrounded now not by hatred, but by memory. And for the first time since Elena Redbird died, the people gathered there no longer looked like strangers standing around a grave. They looked like souls finally being forced to face themselves. The sun never fully broke through the clouds that day. It hung somewhere behind the thick winter sky like a weak lantern hidden beneath dirty cloth while snow continued falling softly across the hill above Dry Creek. Yet somehow the cold did not feel quite as sharp anymore. People had stopped standing apart from one another. The distance between them had begun closing little by little around the grave where Elena Redbird rested beneath cedar boards and drifting snowflakes. Silas Boone watched quietly as Sheriff Grady remained beside the coffin with his daughter holding tightly to his hand. The silver badge still rested in the sheriff's palm, heavy now with something far worse than metal, regret. Around them, the townspeople shifted uneasily as though every memory they tried burying over the years had suddenly clawed its way back into daylight. Then the sound of wood striking frozen ground echoed softly across the hill. Everyone turned. Old Thomas Reed had stepped beside the grave carrying a second shovel. His weathered hands trembled from age as he pushed the blade into the dirt pile near Silas. He did not make a speech, did not ask permission. He simply began helping, one slow shovel at a time. The sound changed something in the crowd. A ranch woman stepped forward next carrying a small lantern from the church. She placed it carefully beside the coffin where its weak flame flickered gold against the gray afternoon. After her came Caleb Mercer, removing his gloves before grabbing another shovel from the wagon. Then Maria Alvarez knelt quietly near the grave brushing snow away from the cedar lid with the sleeve of her shawl like a mother smoothing a child's hair. Nobody ordered them forward. Nobody announced anything. The town simply began changing in silence. Harold Finch watched it happen with growing disbelief. You are all forgetting yourselves, he snapped suddenly. This woman was Apache. The words hung cold in the air. But this time nobody answered with agreement. Not one voice, not one nod. Only wind moving through cedar branches overhead. Sheriff Grady slowly closed his fingers around the badge in his hand before looking directly at Finch. No, he said quietly. We are finally remembering ourselves. Finch stared around the hill searching desperately for support and finding none. Men who once followed his opinions now avoided his gaze entirely. A few even stepped farther from him in the snow. The realization hit harder than anger. The town had moved on without him. Finch muttered something bitter beneath his breath before turning sharply toward the church steps and walking downhill alone, boots slipping against frozen mud while nobody called after him. Silas watched him disappear through the falling snow before returning his attention to the grave. The dirt was filling slowly now beneath several pairs of tired hands. Shovel after shovel. No hurry, no ceremony. Just people trying quietly to repair something broken inside themselves. Father Matthew finally stepped beside the coffin carrying a small wooden cross worn smooth by age. "Elena never asked to join this church," he said softly, while kneeling near the grave. "But she practiced the things we preach better than most of us ever have." He placed the cross gently at the head of the grave before stepping back into the snow. Emily Grady looked up at Silas Boone then. "Mr. Boone," she whispered carefully, "will she be alone up here?" Silas looked around the hill at the gathered townspeople. At the lantern glowing softly beside the coffin. At the old veteran still digging despite trembling hands. At Maria brushing snow from cedar wood with quiet tenderness. Then he looked back toward the little girl. "No," he answered softly. "Not anymore." The wind eased for the first time all day. Snowflakes drifted slower now, softer somehow, settling across shoulders and hats and the fresh mound of earth rising slowly beneath the gray sky. And standing there beside that grave, the people of Dry Creek began understanding something painful. Mercy did not belong to one race, nor dignity to one town. Those things belonged only to the people brave enough to offer them when it was hardest. By the time the grave was nearly filled, evening had begun settling over Dry Creek in slow blue shadows. Snow still drifted through the cedar trees above the hill, but lighter now, softer, like the storm itself had grown tired. Lanterns flickered across the cemetery as daylight faded behind the mountains, casting long golden shapes across the fresh earth surrounding Elena Redbird's resting place. The townspeople remained there despite the cold. Nobody seemed eager to leave anymore. Silence had changed on that hill. Earlier it carried fear and shame. Now it carried reflection. The kind that settles deep into a person once excuses finally run out. Silas Boone leaned the shovel against the wagon wheel and stood quietly beside the grave while the others finished smoothing the frozen dirt. His hands ached from 2 days of digging. Raw skin showed beneath torn gloves. But he barely noticed anymore. Across the hill, Father Matthew lit another lantern beside the wooden cross at the head of the grave. The warm glow spread gently across the snow-covered ground, illuminating the small objects resting there beside the cedar mound. The child's gloves, the silver spectacles, the jar of dried wildflowers, little pieces of memory gathered together where hatred once stood. Sheriff Grady stepped forward slowly carrying a folded wool blanket beneath one arm. It was old and faded with age, stitched carefully along the edges with Apache patterns worn soft from years of use. He hesitated for only a moment before kneeling beside the grave. "Emily slept under this after her fever broke," he said quietly. "Elena told her the patterns were meant to remind people that hard winters always end." His voice nearly failed him at the last words. Carefully, he spread the blanket across the grave before stepping back into the falling snow. Nobody mocked him. Nobody whispered, because the people standing there understood exactly what that gesture cost a proud man like Walter Grady. Maria Alvarez crossed herself softly. Caleb Mercer lowered his hat against his chest. Old Thomas Reed stood with both hands resting atop his cane, while tears rolled silently into his white beard unnoticed by most. Then something unexpected happened again. One by one, people began stepping toward the grave carrying things from town. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. A small carved horse from a child. A pair of work gloves repaired neatly at the fingertips. A miner left behind a silver coin. A widow placed dried lavender beside the lantern. Nobody announced these offerings. They simply appeared quietly, one after another, until the grave no longer looked abandoned by the town below. It looked protected by it. Father Matthew finally opened his Bible beneath the lantern light, though his hands trembled slightly in the cold air. The people gathered closer now, boots crunching softly against frozen earth, while snowflakes melted against coats and shoulders. "I once believed holiness belonged only inside church walls," the priest said quietly. "But sometimes grace walks into town wearing different clothes than we expect. He closed the Bible again after that. No sermon. No long prayer. Just truth spoken plainly beneath a winter sky. The wind eased almost completely then, leaving the cemetery wrapped in a stillness so deep even the horses below. Town seemed quiet. Silas looked around the hill slowly, at the lanterns glowing through snowfall, at the townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder despite all the bitterness they carried only yesterday morning, at the grave now covered not with shame, but with remembrance. Emily Grady stepped beside him and slipped her small hand into his rough, weathered one. "Mr. Boone," she whispered carefully, "do you think she knows?" Silas looked down at the child for a moment before turning his eyes back toward the grave beneath the cedar trees. Snow rested gently across the blanket and flowers while lantern light flickered softly against the wooden cross. He thought about the lonely years Elena had spent helping people who refused to stand beside her in daylight. Thought about the silence she carried while still choosing kindness anyway. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think she knows." Above them, the first stars slowly appeared through the breaking winter clouds while Dry Creek stood together around the grave long after darkness covered the hill. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Dry Creek over the weeks that followed. Snow melted from the rooftops first, then from the muddy streets, and finally from the cedar hill above the church where Elena Redbird rested beneath quiet earth and weathered wood. Spring did not arrive all at once out there on the frontier. Crept in carefully. A little more sunlight each morning. A softer wind across the plains. The distant sound of water moving again through frozen creek beds. And somehow, without anyone speaking much about it, the town itself began changing too. Men who once crossed the street to avoid Apache travelers now tipped their hats quietly when riders passed through. The church doors no longer closed so quickly at sundown. Father Matthew started leaving lanterns lit outside during storms for strangers caught on the road at night. Even the saloon grew quieter whenever people mentioned Elena's name. Not because they hated her anymore, because shame has a way of teaching silence to people who once spoke too loudly. Silas Boone returned to his ranch after the burial and tried to settle back into the old rhythm of lonely mornings and cattle work. But some things could not return to what they were before. Every few days he found fresh flowers resting beside the grave when he rode past the hill. Wildflowers mostly, yellow desert blooms. Sometimes cedar branches tied carefully with red thread. Nobody admitted to leaving them there. Yet the grave never stayed empty. Sheriff Walter Grady visited most often just before dawn when the town still slept. He would stand there quietly beside the wooden cross with his hat in his hands while the first sunlight touched the hills. Some mornings Emily came with him carrying tiny jars filled with fresh flowers gathered near the creek. Other mornings the sheriff came alone and simply sat in silence beside the grave for an hour before riding back to town. People noticed he drank less after that winter. Smiled more too. Harold Finch remained the only man in Dry Creek who never climbed the hill. Pride kept him away even after the others changed. But folks began noticing something strange near the end of spring. Every Sunday morning before church, somebody cleared the weeds growing around Elena's grave before anyone else arrived. The dirt stayed smooth. The lanterns remained filled with oil. Fresh cedar branches always rested beside the cross before storms rolled in from the plains. No one ever saw who did it. Then one cold morning in late April, Silas Boone rode toward town before sunrise and spotted a lone figure standing on the hill through the pale dawn mist. Harold Finch. The rancher stood beside the grave with his hat lowered against his chest and a shovel resting upright in the dirt beside him. He did not notice Silas watching from below. For a long moment Finch simply stood there staring at the wooden cross while morning wind moved softly through the cedar trees overhead. Then slowly, almost awkwardly, he bent down and placed something small at the base of the grave. A single white rose. Nothing more. No speech. No witnesses. Just a tired old man finally surrendering to the weight he had carried too long. Silas never mentioned what he saw that morning. Neither did Finch. Some acts of regret belong to silence. Summer eventually came to Dry Creek with warm winds and long golden evenings rolling across the plains. Travelers passing through town often stopped at the church cemetery after hearing rumors about the grave on the hill cared for by both settlers and Apache riders alike. Sometimes people left flowers there. Sometimes they left coins. One traveler carved a simple sentence into the wooden cross before moving on westward. Nobody removed it. The words remained through rain and heat and winter alike. Silas Boone read them once late one evening, while the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the lantern beside the grave flickered softly in the wind. He stood there alone beneath the darkening sky, hat low over tired eyes, while the plains stretched quiet around him for miles. The words carved into the wood were simple enough. She healed a town that did not deserve her. Silas looked at the grave a long moment after that while evening wind moved gently through the cedar branches overhead. Then he rested one rough hand against the old shovel still leaning beside the cross and gave the smallest nod to the fading light. Out on the frontier, justice rarely arrived with thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, carrying a lantern, carrying a flower, carrying a shovel beside the grave of someone the world should have loved while they were still alive.